Hi, folks. You're with Tassos today. Tassos today, your pushback channel. Excuse me. And thank you for joining this radio audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the definition of peasant and how we've actually come full circle. Now, the medieval definition of peasants and then the definition of peasants, so going through the industrial age or the early industrial age and into, say, the 1920s. So around 1925, the definition of peasants, say, in a place like Britain or the United States, was someone who spent, well, this could be a family unit, but someone who spent 85% or more of their income on the necessities of life, this, accommodation and food and heating or transport or whatever. So the absolute necessities of life, 85% of their income. Now, this definition was, again, we're talking about 100 years ago for that, but those definitions began to change quite substantially, say, in the post-World War II boom, where private property ownership was within the reach of a majority of the population. So really this concept of peasant and the spending that much income just to exist day to day, 85% plus. Remember, that was a minimum threshold to qualify as a peasant. Many peasants would have been spending more than that. But when this private property thing came in, then people fell out, fell out, if you like, or fell up out of the peasant class into what you could call the middle class, which is a very broad-based thing of lower middle class, upper middle class, middle of the middle class, and so on. So that changed, or really the definition of peasant had no use anymore, no value, because there effectively weren't really many peasants that met that definition. There were people of property ownership, the purchasing power of the paycheck, very high levels of employment, people involved in industrial productive work rather than just manual labourers on farms. And even farming, the mechanisation process was huge. The combine harvesters and goodness knows what were changing the entire face of farming. So if you look at the productivity of, say, the Great Prairies, the granary type places of the United States and Canada and huge grain harvests and massive exports of grain and so on. And today, the same. Canada and the United States are huge grain exporters, as indeed is Australia. So the definitions the definition going back really from medieval times up into the early 1920s, or even up through the Great Depression and into the Second World War and so on, this definition of peasant really applied to the majority of people. There were more people that were spending that much money, 85% of their total income, on surviving day to day than were not. And as long as they remained a majority, that definition of peasant was important. Now, it started to change in industrial societies, Britain as an example, as an industrialised, and Western Europe, including places like Germany and so on, where there were those who didn't meet the definition of peasant, but they were supported by various government schemes, welfare schemes, pension schemes, things like that, and that if you like, limited the number of people that technically at least fell into that definition or could be included in that definition of peasant. Now, if we can go back as far as the medieval times, where the aristocrat who had your labour to ostensibly for free, we had to work on the aristocrat's estates. This is agricultural estates, but the aristocrat was duty bound to supply you with some sort of accommodation, which would have been rudimentary, enough fuel to burn fires in winter to keep warm, and you had your own small sort of farm or plot of land that you grow your own food, and then you had common access to, say, things like cows and or the aristocrat owned the granary that would grind your grain into flour so you can make bread and all these sorts of things, or access to horse. And often the aristocrat would charge you it's going to cost you 3 apples if you're going to use my horse to do this or that. So the peasants didn't own anything, or maybe the chickens that they might have owned those, but effectively the peasants didn't own anything, but they got reciprocal value in the accommodation and so on. Now, once you privatise all that, so the landlord is no longer obligated to give you a house to live in or a plot of land to till and access to other facilities. Once you privatise away from that, then in order for that privatising, as in the peasant can own private property, and hence a huge expanding middle class, that's an aberration in history. That just doesn't really happen. You had it briefly, say, during the height of the Roman Empire, that sort of thing, but effectively that's a huge aberration in history. People don't own shit, and other than the elites and the aristocracy. Now, also, there's a difference that the idea where you'd rent a place for a year or two, move to another place, and that didn't happen in the medieval times, and even up until really the post-World War II thing. A lot of people would rent a property from a landlord all their lives. They'd live and die in that same rented property. That's pretty much unheard of today. So the privatisation thing has moved the cost of that lifestyle onto the peasants, who have now become a middle class person or middle class family. But that only works if the wealth and the purchasing power, the productivity, all those sorts of things allow the private citizen, or majority of the private citizens, to have sufficient purchasing power to live a life of private ownership. That's all changed now since the globalists took over. The last 25 plus years, 30 years, since the globalists fully took over, then that's completely changed. So if we look at the average wage today in the West, whether it be in Australia or America or elsewhere, look at the average wage today, then look at, say, just a modest, apartment, then look at the cost of rent today, or even if it's a mortgage, but the cost of rent, the cost of food, the cost of energy, such as electricity and so on, because of all this Green New Deal nonsense that's going on, cost of transport and so on, then we've returned back. We're now back where a majority of Western citizens now meet that definition, that old definition we thought maybe we'd never see again. They now meet that old definition of being a peasant. They are spending 85% of their income on rent, food, and the electricity bill, or the gasoline bill, and so on. So that's now where we're at. We've done, in fact, full circle. We're now at a situation where the majority of the citizenry meet that peasant definition, which is something of a shock, really, considering how far it's come, where you were looking at less than 10% would meet that definition in 1970. Now it's a majority. Now it's more than 60% meet that definition. So we've now become a majority of peasants, all forced upon us by the globalists, by the way. It didn't need to be like this. It didn't have to be like this. It's been forced on us without our agreement, consent, or even without our knowledge, and engaging in massive and quite high-handed levels of deception and trickery and treachery and so on. But that should be a sobering thought, I think, for everybody, that now a majority of Western citizens are peasants. Now, there are some workarounds in this, and the people that are successfully working around it are those who are prepared to live communally in family units. For example, in Western Sydney, as a case in point, there are vast areas and suburbs where there's nothing but Indians live there. It's become an Indian ghetto. But they are buying 5-bedroom, 6-bedroom houses, and they're living there with multiple generations, 3 or even 4 generations in the same house. So you can have anywhere from 6 to 8 adults. You add in cousins and stuff like that. You get anywhere between 6 to 8 adults earning an income, and the grandparents looking after the any offspring so that they're not paying childcare fees and so on. And also they've got access to a lot of affirmative action programs that white people don't. So they're prospering on a relative basis. They're prospering in ways that white people or typical white Western citizens are not or unable to. So by living in these much larger family units, they're able to overcome the limitations of being peasants. The white families relying on one or two income, probably two incomes for the household. Yet these guys have got 8. And so that does change the dynamic. But that's about the only workaround that's available, aside from cronyism and or genuine genius or something like that. The workarounds to this paradigm are very few, but that communal living is one of them. But given the rate of growth of this, I would speculate, and the acceptance, if you like, of the inevitability of the universal basic income is another way of saying that we're as a society, all Western society, all globalist controlled societies, are now really heading towards where we're going back to the medieval times when 98% of the citizenry, 97%, 98%, even more were met the definition of being peasants. And I think we're heading back there fast. And again, already a majority of Western citizens and Western workers meet that definition of peasantry. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.